listening to Unfiltered with Muhammad Uncut, a podcast about personal growth and authentic leadership. If you're looking for tips on how to manage others, get ahead, and make your way up the corporate ladder, this is not the show for you. This podcast is about being of service to others, leading from the heart, and evolving into a better version of yourself. Each episode brings you motivated stories about unfiltered leadership and authentic leaders, those who involve others, use their influence to amplify diverse perspectives, and inspire teams to achieve collective results. If this sounds like you, keep listening. Welcome to the Unfiltered Podcast. We have an unfiltered leader with us today, Rumina Morris. Welcome and thank you for being my guest.
Thank you so much, Mohammed, for having me. I'm very excited to be here today.
I'm excited to have you as our guest of the hour. Could you please explain to everybody, who's Rumina?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I am many things to many people. I am a social worker by background and have spent many years in leadership positions in child welfare. And then I'm also a leader at home. I have 4 children. So by default, I am a leader in my home. And I am very much an advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion, or more appropriately, I would like to say anti-racism. It has been something that I was very attuned to in child welfare, given there's a lot of systemic things that happen in that system that impact people's lives. And so I took it upon myself in that capacity to really focus on how decisions are made based on our own worldviews and our own cultural perspectives, and how we can miss a lot and make all kinds of assumptions that can have drastic consequences for people. And so that is a core part of who I am, and is a core part of what I do today. I've just started my own business. I'm a therapist, and I do coaching and I do consulting, but all specifically around anti-racism, equity, inclusion. So that's kind of the condensed version of who Rumina is.
Well, I'm really looking forward to learning more about that, especially what you're doing in your coaching business and how you're helping people just become better in the world, become a better version of themselves. Because, you know, a lot of people think, well, what's the use of having a coach? I know what I need to do. I know where I can improve and so forth. And it's having a mirror. It's having somebody who could provide us with a bit of guidance, listen, help us surface some of the issues that we're dealing with, maybe some of the solutions. Because, you know, we may have the answers, but we're not sure always how to help those answers become customized to our needs, right? You talk about being a leader at home, a leader at work, a leader in your community. That really paints a very diverse description or definition of leadership. But what does leadership mean to you?
Yeah, I love this question because it can be all things. And for me, it really is not necessarily about power or, you know, power over somebody. Leadership to me equals partnership. It's kind of my mentality that a leader is someone who has the ability to bring out the best in people, but also to challenge their best and to push them and motivate them to be better, do better, and to think differently. And I think that's the biggest piece. I think that leaders have, the way that I've been impacted by leadership and the way that I try to impact others is by what you said, being that mirror and considering alternative hypotheses to their thought patterns, and to consider what they haven't thought about. And not that I have the answers to say, well, you didn't think about this, this is what you should think about. It's just to kind of go, well, what else? What else could we consider in this conversation? What have we not thought about? Who have we not considered to talk to get some more information? Who are we overlooking? So just expanding the thought process, because as I've learned, especially in a field like child welfare, where you are making decisions based on your own lived experience, which may be very incongruent with the person that you're facing. And, you know, obvious things are things like culture and religion and language and customs in terms of showing up in somebody's home and being respectful. To me, that's just the surface. I think there's an importance to understand that everybody has a different way of doing things. I think it's too easy to look at it from the lens of, oh, I've worked with Muslim people, so I know that community, because within that community, you could talk to
There's
myself and
diversity.
there's immense diversity in terms of, you know, the cultural piece or the practices and what people take. But there's also difference in terms of family values, or what, you know, I grew up in a Muslim household. I don't practice now, but in my household, it could very much look very different than my cousin's household. Same sect, same religious group, same cultural country. So and if you go into two families of people who identify as Canadian, white, their homes are not going to run the same. They're going to have different values. Some homes are going to have dinner at the table together, and some are going to do their own thing. That's a cultural difference in that home, regardless of and so there's a big piece to sort of stretch beyond what you know, and not assuming that other homes run the same way. And I think most importantly, when you're working in service and when you're working with people in a human service industry, if you don't have that at the forefront of your head to say, I need to understand what Islam means to you. I need to understand what being a Jamaican means to you. You know, it may mean very different things to somebody else. And so being open and curious and learning from others, that's how you lead. And so leadership for me is partnership, because it's a two-way street. It's not me dictating to you how to do your work. It is about me understanding you, understanding me, understanding others, and then figuring out the best way forward. So yeah, leadership it can be very complicated. It can be made very complicated, but I do insist that we have leaders. You know, I know there's informal leadership, but leadership is just someone who can motivate and influence you to think broader and think differently. So even in the capacity of a parent, I mean, what else do you do but encourage your children to see the world bigger than their home, whether it's traveling, whether it's talking about different experiences, whether it's just when they're upset and having them consider empathy for the other person who may have been involved in the situation. That's all leadership. That's all guiding, it's steering, it's molding, but it's also considering other things. And for me, the best leaders are the ones that sort of encourage you to do and think more than you initially would. And I really hope that's what I bring to people.
Yeah. And the idea of partnership, I haven't heard it expressed that way before. I truly appreciate that, because it's what we both bring to the situation and the formula. And it's not that, you know, I have a certain role and my role is superior to your role, and therefore, you know, I get to authoritatively tell you what to do. It's more of, I lean in and I can listen and I can be curious about what you've got to offer. And I say, hey, so what do you think? You know, Michael Bungistani in his latest book, The Advice Trap, calls out how easy it is for us to just dole out advice, right? It's just about, it's easy. You know, we want to tell people how to make it better. And I think parents do that all the time. We, right, as you're a parent, absolutely. I'm a parent, we think, you know what? We taught you how, and I've caught myself saying this. I'm kind of writing a book that I started and that I put on hold, but it's the 101 Ways Not to Parent. And one of those ways is, don't always pretend to be the expert. You don't always have to have the answers. You know, as the parent, I've caught myself saying, I told you you had to brush your teeth. I've taught you how to do it. I've taught you how to wash your hands. I taught you how to get dressed. You can't exercise your own self-will now and do things on your own. And then I stopped myself saying, wait a minute. I taught you and I showed you so that you can use your faculty of reasoning and do it for yourself and make a mistake. So sometimes those helicopter parents, those authoritative parents with good intentions, we bring that mindset of leadership to a workplace, and rather than allow people the flexibility and the space to make a mistake and to learn, we tell them what we want. But what happens, just like in a home environment where the kid shuts down and breaks down trust, in a work environment, that person says, okay, and then they turn around and say, I don't agree, or they just get it done, but there's not that affinity because they're getting it done because they believe in your vision as well.
This is the difference. And I agree with you in terms of parenting, that is often the authoritative parents, or do as I say because I said. I am only, you know, starting to really understand that parenting is not about us teaching them anything. Yeah. It is all about them teaching us And the minute I flipped that script in my head,
Powerful.
changed everything. Because truth be told, do they not teach us about ourselves, about our values, about who we are at our worst, who we are at our best, who we are without sleep, who we are when we're stressed and have family stuff going on? And it is a very interesting way to look at leading children when you think of it that way, that they are inherently their own people. They are not versions of ourselves, and that their spirits need to be honored. And yes, we are here to model and teach and guide, but we're not there to do the heavy lifting for them. That is their work to do. And so the flip, but I love your parallel to bringing that to the workplace, because one thing I think one of the first lessons I learned when I became in a leadership position, and I remember it being a real aha moment, was that people are not necessarily different when they're out in the community or at home and at work. I think, and I've started to unpack this a little bit. I think I had an assumption that people kind of put on a bit of a front when they come to work, and at home they have a very different sort of, and I'm starting to understand that that may be true for a lot of racialized people or people who are new immigrants who may show up at work a little differently. I mean, we call it code switching, but it is what it is. It is just sort of trying to fit in and having a separate kind of way of being outside of the workplace. But I think for a lot of people from the dominant group, they don't do that because they don't have to. And so I realized very early on that who you are in the office space tends to be who you are in the community and at home. So if you are that person who is constantly unhappy with the way things are, constantly complaining about things, just not being kind and compassionate to people in your space, it kind of is who you are outside. And those in the office who are the kind, caring, responsive kind of people are that outside. And so the parallel between parenting and leadership is very, very real, because we are the same person. So if I find somebody has not followed through with something that I did, whether it's my kid didn't brush their teeth or somebody didn't follow up with a phone call that we were supposed to have, the response that it triggers in me can be very, very similar, right? And so those parallels are very real for me. Mm-hmm.
I do a lot of team building and training where I ask people to think about the more forgiving environment that they, engage in. Is it work or is it home? And I challenge them. I say, if it's home where you have the more forgiving environment, my wife is not giving me pink slip every day, though she should, right? So we tend to take for granted that level of comfort that we have at home because we think that we're not going to get fired, right? And so we put on a persona, we put on a filter. We put on these filters when we go into work, we put on the masks, and all of a sudden we behave differently. Now, you bring up a very, very interesting take on this, because now you're bringing in the diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective that I value with the work that you do. And that is somebody who feels comfortable in the workplace, somebody who's from the dominant race, not because of any fault of their own. I'm not blaming or shaming here, but somebody from the dominant, and you and I, by the way, can be from the dominant also. I want to recognize that we're not just talking about white persons, but we are privileged in terms of our socioeconomic. So somebody who feels comfortable in their skin, in their socioeconomic background, and their ethnic background, they can bring that level of comfort to the workplace, and all of a sudden they can be more genuine in themselves, rightly or wrongly, because being genuine and authentic isn't always being good and doing good. If you can be genuinely authentic and make a positive change, that's where we want to help people land, right? But that level of insecurity that we feel, I have to be different, that imposter syndrome, that I'm an immigrant, or I'm Jewish, or I'm Indian, or I'm Muslim, I'm othered. And now in an environment where I don't feel it's inclusive enough, I have to be like the dominant culture, whatever the dominant culture can be. And that takes away my ability to be me. It takes away my ability to feel comfortable. It takes away from my well-being. So, we, in our workplaces, we're making sure that ladders are in the way. So physical safety, we overlook the mental and emotional safety we have to provide for the well-being of our staff. And so what we do is we now behave differently because we believe we have to put on this filter and be the ideal, the ideal employee. What can employers, recognizing that they have this obligation to well-being, what can they do differently? What's the level of awareness that they can bring so that I don't have to pretend to be someone else at work?
This is the million-dollar question, because it's a tough one in that there's two pieces. There's the singular piece of the individual who is responsible for a team of others. And by that responsibility has an obligation to ensure that they are taking care of themselves and are feeling taken care of emotionally, physically, and all of that stuff. But then there's the other secondary piece, which is the organizational culture and how these issues are approached broadly. I think the first starting step is to at least acknowledge that who people are, how they are perceived in society, matters immensely to their emotional well-being. So, you know, it's not hard today to draw from multiple examples of how othering or being different has impacted on people emotionally, mentally. I mean, I will always maintain, as I'm landing strongly in this feeling, that racism and inequities are a mental health problem. They create all kinds of mental health issues, not things that we are not familiar with: anxiety, depression. If we don't acknowledge that who you are and how you show up is as important as the work that you're doing, you're missing, I don't know how much percent people would say I identify. For me, you're missing like 99% of me is who I am and how I show up and how I have experienced the world. That is what I contribute. And it's very valuable. So not acknowledging or identifying those things, you know, if you have somebody that's from the LGBT community on your team and you've never factored in how that person feels safe, included, what as an organization you could do better, differently if it's not working well. If you haven't had any of that dialogue, not necessarily that you have to say, hey, I know you're part of that community and we need to talk about it, but to talk broadly in terms of inclusion and feeling safe for everybody. Even people that struggle with mental health and that stigma, right? They show up at work and they may not be doing well that day. And if you don't know your people and accept them for who they are and what they bring, then you're missing a lot, and people are going to be unmotivated, they're going to be disengaged, and they're going to leave. Because if I can't be my authentic self, I don't belong here. And if I don't belong here, this is part of our inherent human characteristic, is to feel belonging. So you spend most of your life in a workplace that doesn't feel like you belong, it's not a fit.
Or worse, they stay and they're disengaged and demotivated and they don't want to be there, but you know, they won't leave and you probably can't make them, right?
And so you're stuck.
You're stuck, right? And so, you know, I always say that diversity is a fact, but inclusion is a choice, right? So
absolutely.
Your point about that there's so much diversity out there and we don't know. So I can talk about diversity from ethnicity or gender or sexual orientation or language or color. There are so many aspects of diversity I still don't know. And so we can't expect leadership or organizations to embrace every definition of diversity that is out there. But to your point, what they can do is they can widen the circle of inclusion and safety. And so rather than have this understanding of what inclusion looks like, we need to be flexible and allow that circle to organically grow with the input and the buy-in and the letting people weigh in, so that when my voice is amplified within this organization, within this community, by default, by me being open and willing to learn and willing to put down my guard and remove my armor and allow the other person to express and to be, right? Then that circle of inclusion becomes wider. So an organization that is aware of differences, embracing those differences to make us stronger, more innovative, more creative. We don't have to understand what the definition is for every difference. We will eventually, as we start writing and speaking and engaging with others, but we have to have that mindset that I'm open to learn, I'm open to listen, I'm open to change.
And I think also I think the initial way of addressing diversity, and I say that in air quotes, was to say, well, if you enter a home where the family is from China, then you need to know X, Y, and Z about how you enter that space. Yes, there are some overarching things, practices that are pretty standard that you might want to inform yourself about, but I don't think you have to. I mean, there are so many faiths and cultures and backgrounds that I've never ever interacted with people from that area. I don't have to. All I have to do is be curious. All I have to do is be humble. All I have to do is know that there are other ways of existing and to be open to that without judgment, because only in that openness of like, so tell me more. How does that work? Because again, I'll say, if I go to someone who's from Afghanistan and I enter their home and they tell me all about how they practice their culture, their language, their food, their music, that's like, I am no expert except to know how that family operates. So,
or that individual, because it's so unique to that individual.
This is it. Have you not taken? I've taken from my culture. There's some I've taken, there's some I've left, and all of my siblings have done so differently, and that has to be okay. And then we're all here. And so Canadian culture is part of us too. So where does that fit in? There are not Muslims the entire world over celebrating Christmas, but there are many, many in Canada who do. How do you, yeah, me too. So how do you make amends with that, right? So what is our culture? It's a mishmash of what we've chosen. Culture is not defined by the country that you're from or the path that your generations before took to get here. It's defined by how you live and the bigger space that we live in. So yeah, the diversity of sort of like knowing all these different ethnic backgrounds, for me, it's almost insulting because it doesn't really tell you anything. I mean, is it important to know that you might not want to serve alcohol to somebody that's Jewish or, or Muslim? Yeah, maybe it's respect. But if you mess up, you don't do it with you don't drink, what's wrong with you people? You do it with tell me more. What's that about? Is that religion? Is that culture? Is it personal choice? Because there are many people who are from the Dhamma group who don't drink, and they're not, it's not because it's faith. So just being curious about, and I think, I wonder, because I have worked in a role for so many years where I've entered people's homes in some of the most unfortunate circumstances, to be real. I couldn't have imagined in my, as you said, like my privileged middle-class upbringing. I had a clean home. My mom was home. Food was healthy. I had no idea how some people live. I've gone into homes where you have to step over dog poop and garbage is infested with flies and there is no bedding on the children's beds. Like, just really.
Here in Canada.
Here, down the road.
Yeah, right. That's unfortunate that we allow members in our community to have to live in these situations, right? I think there's a certain level of accountability. I don't want to get into it, but in a previous life, I tried to get into politics too because I wanted to make a difference. And I saw that it wasn't fair that in certain areas of London we have here. So for listeners, this is London, Ontario. We have one of the 10th poorest areas in the country. Right? And we have to do enough. We have to work hard enough because people don't choose to live in misery.
Thank you for saying that. People don't choose, and yet we spend a lot of time judging those who are living differently. And I think that's where some of the compassion comes from. And that's what I'm trying to say, is that because I've been in so many homes and have met with so many people from different walks of life where life has happened, there's always a story. People didn't, I mean, some children are born into that, obviously, but in terms of adults and their feeling of satisfaction and happiness and joy, it doesn't come from living in those circumstances. And so, I've really learned to ease up on the whole judgment thing, because we are all just one step away from being in those circumstances. That comes with a bit of gratitude, but it also comes with perspective. And I think it's unfortunate that most people will only ever know their lens and their world and the way that it was shaped by their families. If they don't work in a field where you are entering people's spaces or people's lives, if you will, in some capacity, then you only know who's around you, and you typically surround yourself with people who are similar to you. So it's not that I don't understand why people have very narrow minds. I actually think that's a default. I mean, how can you, not everybody can go into everybody's homes.
Right.
I mean, I see it as a privilege to have really broadened my understanding of humanity and how the system is failing in many ways and all those good things. But the biggest thing it's taught me is that judgment doesn't serve anything, because how can you judge when you only have one perspective? If you had 50, 100 perspectives and you were to say, well, that's not a good one. Okay, maybe, but you only have yours. And so in terms of, leadership, as we go back to that piece, is all about relating to people. How do you connect on a human level? What makes great leaders? It's not their schooling. It's not their written abilities. It's not even their leadership abilities. It's their ability to connect and engage. I see you as a person. What do people want in work, in home, in their family life? They want to feel connected. They want to feel valued. They want to feel like they are seen for who they are and that their contributions matter. And if you ask people in their workplaces if they feel those things, most will say absolutely not. A good leader for me is someone who can look at you and see you as a person first.
Right.
Can acknowledge you for, I'm very big on we're people first. So whatever happened 5 minutes before I got into this building, I carry that with me. When I go back to my home and I'm caring for my aging parent and my child is sick and this and that, it's all me. We don't compartmentalize our lives. That's kind of what I was trying to say. Like,
we don't, but we do. We don't, but we do.
Try to.
Right. And then what happens is
over.
It does. And when we don't provide that flexibility and that comfort, in, let's say in a work environment, for people to be authentically themselves, then what is happening is they feel the need to compartmentalize. They feel the need to put on a mask or to adorn a filter and become someone else, whether it's to hide their sexual orientation or to hide their ethnicity or their religion. Like, if I looked at you, I can see that you're a person of brown color, right? I don't know if I guess your religion. And maybe not that my recognition of your differences doesn't matter, but it shouldn't impact how I behave with you. It should all, right? And when you talk about partnership and you talk about the curiosity to lean in and to learn, it's to say, you know what? I don't have different lens for everybody. These are my lens, and this is how I'm going to be able to see. But teach me, tell me. So whether we work with coworkers, whether with our friends, people in our community, those who invite us into their home, people that we serve, people that we aspire to contribute to their visions at work, whatever, right? Open the conversation, have a discussion, be open, let people weigh in and they'll buy in. Ask, and what happens is we paint people with a broad stroke, the same brush. And we say that, all white people are therefore racist because they're not open to learn. And I take offense to that, because what's happening right now as we amplify the voices from the Black Lives Matter, some people think that this is about shaming and blaming one dominant culture, and it's not. I'm Muslim. I look within my own Muslim community, and there's a lot of racism to people who are colored, people who are Black.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
And so it's stopping and saying, stop, this is not permissible. It's looking to the white culture or dominant culture and having those discussions and saying, what can we do better? Go ahead.
I was just going to say, you're just triggering me to say, I like to profess I am a racist, anti-racist. I couldn't not be racist. I could not identify myself as not racist because I'm part of the bloody problem. And as you talk about the Muslim community, so let me give you a little background that my parents, my ancestors are from the Middle East and then India, and then went to East Africa. So I heard one of your guests recently from Uganda, and I was like, that's where my mom's from, and that my dad is from Tanzania. So, but a very interesting sort of racial piece in terms of anti-Black racism, being South Asian in East Africa. There's a hierarchy where the white people in the structure are seen as the top of the line, and the indigenous Black people were at the bottom. So South Asians would hire them as their servants, as their store clerks, a very clear delineation. And of course, very culturally, stick to your own. So stick to your own because we're Muslims, stick to your own because of race. I mean, this is not a question. They are different. And so the negative things that would be said about Black people are very real, because it was a complete understanding that we are better and whites are better than us. There's the layer. And
Right.
so when you talk about, community, it's not the dominant group. It's all of us.
It's all
We
of
have
us.
all been
Yeah.
a part of this. And
Yeah.
to add to it, I married a man who is Black. He's Canadian, he's Black, and all that came with that in terms of family drama and whatnot. But I have 4 mixed race children, and this is where it gets interesting, because for me,
Or beautiful.
they are kind of cute. But where I struggle now as a parent, as they're getting older, is I've kind of had this idea that they're mixed children. They are half South Asian. No question, that's who they are. But you know what? It doesn't seem to matter what I think, because the world identifies them as Black, always will. And in turn, they too identify themselves as Black, because that's who they are when they walk out on the street. They're young. I mean, 15 to 9 and a couple of 12-year-olds in there, but they are understanding. I'm even getting called out by my daughter, which I love. She's just a very strong-minded young lady. She's 12, and she called me out and said, because she knows what I do in terms of anti-racist work. And she called me out and said, "Mom, just so you know, you can never speak to an experience that I have as a Black girl."
And that's your daughter.
That's
Part
my
of your
daughter.
flesh and blood.
And she is absolutely
Amazing.
right. And I have to check myself, because I think I know a lot. But
Right.
it was that rude awakening of recognizing that, no matter what, I'm racialized. I have experienced ignorance and racism. Absolutely. Yes. But I also will never know what it is to be mixed race. I'll never know what it is to walk the world that way. So in my own home, I have to listen. I have to learn. I struggled when the whole blackface stuff, not recently with Justin Trudeau. I'm talking like years ago, when somebody had said something at a party about her husband had dressed as Tiger Woods and had put the blackface on and didn't see a problem with it. And I tell you the truth, I was an adult at this point, and I didn't understand what is wrong, if you will, with that. It was my husband that I had to go to help me understand so that I can explain it better. So meaning I'm learning in terms of anti-Black racism. I know what I need to know enough, but I still have so much to learn. My kids and my family teach me. So who am I? I'm no expert. I am a racist and I am an anti-racist, and both can be true at the same time. I'm part of the problem, but I plan to be a big part of the solution.
Exactly. And that mindset, we don't know what it's like to be Black. We can become an ally. We can empathize. We can treat people as they want to be treated and not as we think they should be treated. And, being part of the solution is recognizing our centuries of colonization and slavery.
Thank you.
I don't just mean in North America. Again, as a person who's Middle Eastern, I can tell you that Middle Eastern countries, when they want to get higher help, they call them Sri Lankan. So that's how you say maid. Somebody from Sri Lanka. When,
absolutely.
in the Arabic language, unfortunately, and this is something recent that I've awoken to, is the word for Black is not just aswad, which is Black, but it's abid, which is slaves. And so I hear people still using that language, and I had to awaken myself to be aware. So,
yes,
we are racist, anti-racist, we have good intentions. So in part, we want to be allies and learn and grow and be forgiving, have others forgive us because we are part of the problem, but say we are part of the solution. So whether we're talking to someone who's white, someone who's dominant, someone who's indigenous, someone who's Black. I was recently part of a conversation with a Black woman, and I was organizing an event, and I said, as a woman of color, she goes, "Mohammed, I'm a Black woman." And I'm like, "Oh God, I made a mistake." This is recent, months ago. And I had this feeling here, and I thought, how can I make that mistake? And I made a mistake. She wasn't judging me. She wasn't shaming me for it, right? She was educating me, because after the fact, I learned this woman is spending all her life fighting for her identity. Right. Understanding what that means in a non-Black, right? And I want to go somewhere where I don't think you're coming from this place, but I have to say this. When you're talking earlier about you have Black children, And I know when you say this, I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth, but I want to a parent who has Black children, whether they are Black themselves or not. When we say the word Black, it's almost like we're looking over our shoulder. There's almost this feeling of insecurity saying Blackness. Because it's on the one end of the spectrum, it's racialized, it's the lower, like you were saying, in Caribbean, the country of you're referring to was
Tanzania,
Uganda, but then in North America, and I believe you were talking about here when you came to this country, now they were looking at people who were Black on the lower end of the spectrum, right? So we're looking at Black can be this racialized, but it can be this beautiful thing. We don't look at white or dominant in the same spectrum. And so when I, as a person who hears the word Black, or you say I have Black children, I want to move to a place where I say it with celebration. And I don't have to say it. You know, I had a guest recently who has a Black son and Black children, and she's saying she's white. So she said to me, her son still struggles when walking down the street because he sees himself as a 6 foot tall Black person.
Right.
I don't want to be in a community where a Black person feels they are looked at differently because of their Blackness, looked at less or inferior. I want to, if I look at that Black person, I want to look and celebrate them for who they are at first as individuals, as people, and for being Black. I want you to look at me as a Muslim and celebrate me for being Muslim, whatever kind of Muslim I am. But celebrate me as the individual. So when you walk into my home and you step over the threshold and hopefully there's nothing you're stepping over, you know, you don't bring that baggage of, you know, your experiences, but you're there with an openness to learn and to lean in and be curious. And I think when we can bring that definition of leadership to our parenting, to our workplace, to our community involvement, you sit on a diversity and inclusion group that helps to look at how we can do things better in our community. And I think part of it is not necessarily bringing the playbook and telling people how to behave, but writing it together. What best practices can you help us apply in some of the things that we need to do better as a community?
Oh, as a community, I think there is so much. I mean, we're so far away from that place that you're talking about.
Why? Why, Rumina?
Because we have been inundated with messages from the time this country and others have been created with messages that Blackness is less. And you know, I'm so glad you brought about colonialism. It's such a word that resonates for me because it has intersected in every part of mine journey here, right? From India being colonized, East Africa being colonized. My family had to leave East Africa because after colonization and the dictator who was the army general kicked all the South Asians out. Okay, this is because after colonization, the country is trying to figure out how to move forward. It's not right or wrong, it's how it happened. Canada in its association with the UK, like we are founded and not racism. That differently on racism. So that's the big why. And we are only now starting to really understand how deeply systemic it is and that this isn't a person problem. And so a person can look at, you know, I mean, there's what positive things could you think about when you see a Black man who's 6 foot or a child even walking down the street? What positive associations do we have? I don't have them. I know you don't. Meaning, you know, I had them, right? We had them. And I think it's I think it's powerful because to your point about being racist and anti-racist, we grew up. Yeah. You know, when I lived in St. Thomas and we'd come to London and I'd see people who were indigenous and, you know, I used to use the word Indian, natives, right? Yes. And we were told these are a bunch of people who were always drunk and homeless. Yes. Did we ever, and let's recognize that there is a problem with alcoholism in the indigenous community, but did we ever recognize what we did to cause these people to be homeless and to abuse these substances? I think
as
that's
opposed, right?
yeah. I think that's
What
those are
triggered
the
this?
dots. Those are the dots that I hope are starting to get connected.
I hope.
Because we've
I think
done a
they
lot
are.
of, yeah, I think we've done a lot of looking at them over there and going, look at those people over there.
We
And you're
got
right,
so much
not
work to do.
connecting. Could it be because we put them on land that was not theirs?
Right.
Could it be because we
took away
their
land
children,
that was theirs?
took away, took away their children, killed them.
Yeah.
Like, could there be a connection? And I think for the dominant groups, it has been such a disassociation. It's over there in the past, and it wasn't
Well, my
me.
ancestors, what do I have to do with it, right?
But you and I have everything to do with our ancestors. Their blood runs through our veins today, and that is true for all people. So,
as well as their mentality.
Thank you. And DNA, like our DNA, literally, we know this. It literally changes, and to have survived any kind of major genocide, such as what has happened to Indigenous people, such as what has happened and continues to happen for Black people, what has happened, like the Holocaust, like whatever you've come through, your DNA has literally changed in order to survive. So there's a bit of an awakening that there is some dots being connected. I don't think we're at a point where people can actually see their role in it, right? So there's a real separatism between the system and the people. And the people if the system is not made up of people, then what the heck is it?
Yeah.
So it's oh yes, there are things that we have in place.
It's the laws that we wrote to edify the systems that keep people out and keep us in.
And so, it's such an easy, like you can start with any system, right? You can walk through from experiencing school and the racism there. And people who don't experience it or don't know about it truly believe it doesn't exist. And this is where we have to listen and we have to learn that these individual experiences are a collective experience that is broadly experienced across the country, across North America. Wait, hold on. Around the globe in many countries. Yeah, it's not a one person fix. Each of us can do our best and still not change the system, because if you are looking at, so let me give you an example in terms of who makes the phone calls to the Children's Aid Society? Teachers, doctors, right? What information are they going on? What they see in front of them, coupled with their understanding of the world. So that's not their fault. That's all they can do. It is our responsibility to be able to think bigger and consider what else is at play here. But the system, there's people involved who are well-intentioned, looking out for everybody. The person who receives the call, oh my gosh, that happened, let me go talk to manager. The worker who goes, oh my gosh, this happened. But our job is to investigate and learn and figure it out. But there are so many people in that process. Police officer pulls you over. It starts there. Then you end up going to the court. So now you're dealing with a judge who has his lived experience and his judgments, and he's seen 20 Black people that day, and you're just another. And it's true, they're all criminals. And then off you go to jail, and then you get a harsher sentence, and then you have a harder time getting it. It is not people necessarily doing it intentionally, and it is not a system that is. It needs to be seen as, what are the barriers to people having success? What are the limitations that we put into place that exclude people from certain opportunities? And I think there's definitely movement. I feel great that there's lots of attention on this. I feel really sad that we're only here.
But we need a lot more. We're all complicit. And again, to bring out your point, I don't think you're pointing the finger by saying we're racist. We can't identify what is breaking us until we've, or what's going to fix us until we identify what's broken us. We can't go to the doctor and, tell them about what's hurting. If we've got a muffle over our mouth and, our hands are tied, and we can't tell them our shoulder is hurting, they have to guess. So to name the emotion, or to name the thing that is causing us to break, is the first step in recognizing that something has to be fixed. So saying that we are all complicit, we are all being racist to some degree, and before we can move towards a position of becoming anti-racist, this is a consistent, ongoing process. We, to rid ourselves of our implicit bias and to really look at things through a different lens. We're going to continue to be racist, and not just racist against Black or Indigenous.
No.
Racist against the other. Racist because they do not comply with our bias or with the stereotype we've painted.
And I would like to differentiate a little bit, because I've only recently identified myself as a racist, anti-racist. Meaning, I understand racism to be the power. There's a difference between, racism and discrimination. So if you come into my store and I don't treat you as nicely as a white person or a Black or whoever.
Discrimination.
That's just right.
Yeah.
But racism is when you have the power to do something about it. So I don't know that everybody is a racist. I know that I am part of a system, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, whether it's, those systems are racist. And by virtue of being in them and working in them, I can do anti-racist work. But if I'm part of that structure, I can't exclude myself from that. So not everybody, I speak for myself in terms of how I have played a role in it while also working against it. Discrimination,
well, Rumina,
yes, go ahead.
It's like, what we're learning right now with the Black Lives Movement, you can't choose to remain silent. Martin Luther King said it years ago that silence is not an option, because it's like me closing my eyes and saying, I don't see it, I don't hear it, therefore it doesn't exist, right? But, and I think that's how I'm interpreting that. I'm not calling people out. I'm not shaming and blaming, but I'm saying, look, you've got to recognize that if you're not actively working towards an anti-racist environment, you're contributing to racism being allowed. And just to stand back and say, I'm not part of the problem, while you're not being part of the solution. But
right, and so, yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please finish.
Well, it just requires action, yes. To be an anti-racist, you have to be actioning something, doing something differently, not just thinking. That's a shifting of the perception. That's fine, but it's actively, whether it's speaking up, whether it's writing, whether it's getting active in the community, whatever, but it requires some action.
Well, and I've quoted this a few times on the podcast, and I've got to give credit to the person who actually inspired me to remember. There was a writer for the Washington Post, and I'll have to remember the name because I've referenced it now several times, but he said, every time a Black person dies, white people create book clubs. And his point to it was,
say it again,
every time a Black person dies, white people create book clubs. So, we see the reactionary position that workplaces are now doing by creating diversity and inclusion initiatives and movements, and it's not wrong, right? If we now look at what happened to George Floyd and say, okay, it's time that we do things differently, that's great, but it's not enough. It's not just that I have to go read a book and educate myself and sit around and talk about it and what can I do? What can I do differently? Not what can I think differently? So this is the part of the podcast where I say to you, Rumina Morris, with your background in diversity and inclusion and leadership, what can you share with my listeners to help them become more educated, less racist, more anti-racist, better versions of themselves, better leaders in the community, more inclusive, forgiving, and open to learn leaders?
I think the first thing is to truly understand that you have only your perspective. I think that is such a big piece, that you have to enter spaces with that at the forefront of your mind. So whether it's a team meeting, whether it's a family gathering, you are entering space knowing that your lens is the only one you have. It's such an actionable thing to do, to question yourself and to question others, that whole curiosity thing. In terms of leaders and employers who are trying to do this work, I think you kind of really hit it in that it's not the how. You can learn the how. It's the why. Why is it important? And when you strip back every layer of why is it important for people to feel safe and included and in a space of any sort, it's because you bring out their true essence, their true self. And in that is such beauty. This is who you want at your tables. These are the people who feel like, even if I get it really wrong, it's okay. Even if I talk about my wife at home or, whatever, like I can be me. And those people give. and they think about people you know who are really, and there's not a lot, but who are really happy and thriving in their work. It's either because they're working for themselves, and so they are only navigating from that place, or they feel heard, they feel connected because their leaders see them as valuable. So for me, the biggest thing is, I think ego gets in the way a lot, because you have the piece around, you know, being a really good connecting kind of person that allows people to feel, okay, this is someone who cares about me and I can bring my best self to work. That is very important. But we are in a society where hierarchy and leadership is equal to power, and that ends up impacting on ego. So for me, there's the one piece of being a good communicator and a good, kind, compassionate, empathetic person first, and then you really need to have your ego in check. And it goes back to the same thing, that you just don't have all the answers. You don't have all the perspectives. You are just one part of the learning and the exploration that needs to happen as we have these conversations. When we think about leadership as we go higher up, we know statistically white men tend to be at the top. So white men, or men in general, in terms of power, has such a significance in our history. We can't ignore that. So essentially, if the majority of leaders are white men, then we are saying that white men need to come into spaces, or I'm saying, with compassion, with empathy, with kindness, recognizing that their people are people first. And we're asking them to check their egos a little bit and lean on other people's expertise. I don't know that that's very easy culturally for white men to do. I don't think we've set them up for success.
Or
in that
any
area.
men. Any men, and this is something I talk about often on this podcast. Men are not taught to be in touch with their feminine, softer, more emotionally intelligent self. We have to put up this front, this filter of being tough, and it's hard for us to show up, right?
How does that work? Especially if you look at any organization, okay, so we know the top are primarily men and primarily white, and then at the bottom, your front line, who's serving your customers, who's answering the phones, are primarily female and racialized. How can you have existed all this time without even that acknowledgement of the optics of that? And how can you, from your place of privilege, connect compassionately, empathetically with, you know, my situation, because my son got pulled over by police and I'm freaking out about that, or there was police in my neighborhood and I don't know what, you know, whereas you see police as safe and there to help you. How can we compassionately, empathetically connect on a human level? We're coming from such different spaces and places. How can you check your ego when your ego is what's got you up, because you have exactly all the things you said. So, you know, we're in a place where it's very hard to do that work, to bring this to a point where, you know, I'm going with the white male and a black female in those very, very different hierarchical positions can have a conversation like you and I are having, like a truth talk. Right. We're so far from that because we don't see that connection as being even valid.
I'm looking at your physical gestures, and what you're doing is you're bringing them together. And so what I think is we have to look at equity and equality, and we have to say, what's the commonality that we can find together? White person, male, black woman, female, so black female. How do we find commonality? I mean, we may come from many different backgrounds, but we form one nation, and that's humankind. And so when we start looking at these values that we share, at the humility that we can create within our humanity, all the things that you've shared with us on this interview, that's where we start. Yeah. I don't have the playbook, and we don't need the playbook.
That's right.
But we can write, you know, the definition of inclusion together. And I want to thank you for contributing to that discussion today, because it's people like you in the community. And, you know, I know we're talking about here, my home, London, Ontario, our physical geographical community. But this conversation is about London, England. It's about anywhere. It's about any place where you exist with another human being. And that's everywhere, right? It's about looking and finding the beauty in the other, finding the humility, and as you say, knowing that it's about our compassion and empathy. And start there and start somewhere. You don't know where you're going, but you know where you got to start. So Rumina, I want to thank you for the conversation today. This is a conversation that's so dear and near to my heart about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So blessings to you. Thank you for the conversation, and thank you for being an unfiltered leader.
It's been a lot of fun.
All the best
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to Unfiltered, the show about authentic leadership and personal growth. Like what you heard? Click subscribe, share it, and tell a friend about it. And don't forget to leave a rating.